As I comment on Neville Goddard's 1969 lecture, Many Mansions, we will be enjoying a hot pot meal in the Japanese countryside. This meal is called Sukiyaki, thin cuts of meat, vegetables, in a sweet soy sauce and dashi broth. In this lecture, someone asks Neville why sometimes bad things happen to good people that don't seem to deserve it. And Neville told this person, "It's not a matter of deserving. These are states. At one moment in time, they entertained this with feeling, with intense feeling, and then these things happen. And they might have passed judgment on one who had a similar condition and relate the condition to some unlovely thing they know of that person. So with this, we see, it's not a matter that people get what they deserve necessarily. On one hand, what is it we choose to feel, often unconsciously? What do we fill our days with? And what feelings does that fill us with? But we must also remember the law of boomerangs. If you wish something upon another, and that other wouldn't want it or wish it upon another, that energy boomerangs back to you since we are all connected. And that's why it is also important that you learn to exercise your own imagination and become aware of what you're feeling and what you fill your days with and how that makes you feel. And if you're going to entertain things that you might not want to manifest, at least make sure at the most poignant time, for most people that's into sleep, that you feel what you do want to feel and bring it into sleep each night. Neville tells the story of a little girl and how the little girl had little bumps on her neck. And when taken to the hospital, she was given the verdict of cancer, malignant cancer. And so this man that told Neville the story, when he heard his wife telling a story to the friend, he said, "I allowed her voice to tell me completely different. I heard just enough. She kept on talking, but she didn't know from my expression that I wasn't listening. I didn't hear any word after I heard what she said as she kept building the picture. Her voice faded from me, and then I constructed what she said, and I had her tell me that the whole thing was false. Although there were 5 doctors each agreeing that this thing was malignant and therefore fatal, I let it fade completely and brought in a complete reversal of that verdict. And then a 6th doctor was brought in, reflecting this persisted, and he reflected the persisted change of the father, saying, I'm sorry to disagree with my men in the profession, but it is not malignant and it is not cancer. And the doctors were called in again to investigate, and they all confessed that they were wrong, because she couldn't possibly have had cancer. So the child lived on with no cancer. This man learned that all things are possible to God, and God is his own imagination. And you already do it, and you can do it now, but intentionally. Imagine so well, for a moment you're persuaded, just like when you daydream, or you watch a movie and forget you're watching actors, actresses. Well, you can do it for yourself, or someone you love. Set them free in imagination, and persist until it is so. You can use the very technique. You hear something you don't like, well, you can learn to tune that out and hear what you want instead. And Neville warns in this lecture, it's not about being violent, and not necessarily violent in the way that you think. Sometimes we're violent with our appetites, like those who feel they have to be a strict vegetarian or celibate to be able to be good. Or they blame others why they don't have good. And Neville's saying, you don't have to do any of that. Instead, appropriate what you want. And you appropriate with the use of your imagination, feeling as though what you want already is, and regularly visiting that mood. For some, once is enough, and for others it may take weeks, months, sometimes years or more. Neville shared another story with his mother, who he said understood this law beautifully. When the mother wanted to go on vacation, she had beautiful summer dresses made for such an occasion, and this was her way to appropriate a trip. Neville's father was busy in the business world and wasn't aware of what she was doing day to day. But then the father came home and suddenly felt to say, you know, I don't want you here. You don't look very well. You look tired. And I've just booked you for New York City. You are sailing next week. All you have to do now is go and get a visa because you are sailing next week, and you're going to be there for 3 months. So Neville says, do it all in your wonderful imagination. If you want something to happen that hasn't been happening, you must move in imagination. Neville says you can move from one state to another in the twinkling of an eye. You don't need to sit down and burst a blood vessel. You simply do it in the twinkling of an eye. Because remember, Neville also taught the law of reverse effort. If you put too much effort in, and especially if it starts to become a chore, you're going about it wrong. And you may very well get the opposite, or it may be very delayed. Think about the naturalness when you go throughout your day, and you catch yourself in a daydream. How simple, light, easy, and natural it is, and yet when lost in a daydream, it can feel more real than even reality. And in this lecture, Neville also teaches you what to do with others around you who are suffering. Don't sympathize and keep them in that state, but instead teach them the law. Show them through your examples. And whether they use it or not, know that a seed has been planted. And one thing that people get caught up on, people confuse the person with a state. In a sense, all people are consciousness, and all that they do, good or bad, are just different states they fall into. And once you realize this, it becomes more easier to forgive and move one to another state, to move someone from poverty to wealth, from sickness to health, from violence to peace. Neville says, even the so-called wicked. Neville says, persuade yourself that he is generous, kind, wonderful person, and he will have a change in heart and not know why. Something will happen within him, and he will become kind and generous, all that you imagined him to be. If you want him to be that kind of person, imagine him to be it. Persuade yourself of the reality, and he will conform to it. And Neville shares a story with his wife back in 1945, when she used to work at a music hall for 11 years as a costume designer, and she didn't get along at all with the head producer. And Neville says, I told her one day, darling, he couldn't do anything for you unless you allowed it. You actually feel that he is of no earthly good. You feel you are a cultured American lady. You went to Smith College. You were born and raised in a lovely environment. You never heard unkind things in your home. You never saw anything that was cheap. Your mother had a lovely taste, beautiful things. And Neville's wife's father was the managing director of the music hall. But when she went there, she didn't ask for any favors. So with the anger she had with the boss, she often carried on angry inner conversations with him. And Neville finally said, now stop it, and allow him to praise you for your work, even if he's always condemning and criticizing. So Neville told her as she walked the 5 blocks to the music hall, imagine him praising her for her works, and using all of her designs, and that he even goes so far as to ask her father for a bigger budget to use all of her designs. Assume all this in imagination. And Neville says in 24 hours, it all changed. He raved about her wonderful collection, and just as Neville painted a beautiful word picture, he did just that. He went to her father and begged him to increase the budget so they could use all of her designs. And from that day forward, he radically changed his attitude towards her. Why? Because she changed hers towards him. So sometimes we get stuck in a loop. When someone does us wrong, especially someone close, or someone maybe we're not close to, but they do what we feel is a great wrong. Especially these things continue over time. We cannot help but feel anger, and maybe even vengeful, and it just perpetuates everything. But what if we started to pay attention to our inner conversations, especially when upset? What if we could enter into the groove of imagination and direct a mind movie of what we want instead, and fall under our own beautiful spell, and feel its reality even for a moment, feel the joy. If we could do that each day, even for a moment, but really do it, then you can get right to the source of the creation of all your experiences in life and transform them. The point is, if you're experiencing unlovely things in life, learn to watch your conversations and get creative. Practice having lovely conversations, and be careful what you give your attention to, thus your feelings, on TV, social media, people. Learn to be more discerning, or at least make sure at the poignant times like into sleep, you revise all the things throughout the day and bring a lovely mood into sleep each night, no matter how long it takes, 70 times 7. Now, let us go into the silence. If you can recall any unlovely conversations you have recently had, or heard of another, and want to hear something lovely for them, let us do that in this moment of silence. Now, let us go into the silence. Good.